So I just want to introduce myself a little bit. Feel like you've probably heard from me from recordings multiple times, but my name is Angie Kim, and I am teaching at Gordon-Conwell on Hamilton campus, one of the counseling professors. And my primary clinical background is in working with patients in community mental health settings. So I've worked with many low SES clients, and it's been known that probably 80% or close to 80% of community mental health clients have been survivors of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse clients. So that's where my clinical background's been in. I've also worked with diverse clients, clientele population. So individuals of different faith and ethnic backgrounds. And my teaching and research interests also have been relevant to today's topic of culture and multicultural counseling. So one of the courses that I teach at Gordon-Conwell is the training counselors in training of how to work with clients, patients from different ethnic as well as faith, religious, gender, and other backgrounds. So today, as we talk about the importance of culture, and that's not just ethnic culture, but our own family culture, as well as our church and faith culture, it will be important for us to take this time to be more self-introspective and increase our self-awareness of how our individual culture have shaped us, so that when we are working with our congregation and church members, we may be better equipped to serve them and see how our own perceptions and biases and stereotypes could negatively influence those that we're working with. So it's, I think, first and foremost important for us to be, again, that introspectiveness of individuals is of primary importance. So I want to recap what I've spoken about during the recording, and maybe many of you remember or need reminder. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through a little bit of what I presented, and we're going to do discussions on each topic. So we're going to kind of go back and forth between like summarizing what I've talked about and applying it to within our own small groups that we've had throughout today. So first, we will talk about, again, how our family and maybe different generations in our family have affected our expressions of anxiety. And you may or may not relate to this personally if you feel like you've never experienced anxiety. Maybe, I don't know if any of you would say you never experienced anxiety or stress, but I'm presuming that everyone has experienced some kind of stress. So you can kind of talk about anxiety as, a disorder, or just even having experiences with stress and how that was dealt with within your own family. And then we'll talk about a little bit of our own ethnic culture, and that can be, our European American ethnic background, or Asian American, and I'm not sure what other ethnicity I see here, or Black American ethnic culture, and what our own ethnicity have said about the expressions of anxiety and mental health. And then lastly, about just specific to this audience today, about how our Christian faith and what the church has talked about in encouraging or discouraging expressions of anxiety. So the culture that, as I talked about in my presentation, we're going to kind of refer culture as to a system of common heritage, shared beliefs, norms, and values that groups people together. So with this definition, I was also curious, and I'm kind of going in order of the worksheet that you have been given by the team. And the first question, we're going to kind of do this as like a large group, but how would you define culture, and what does culture mean to you? And secondly, what have you noticed about the influence of culture on expressions of anxiety? And I kind of want to, I don't know how we've been with volunteering ourselves throughout today, but if anyone feels comfortable sharing, there's no right or wrong answer. Just in your own perspective, how would you define culture?
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Sophia. I'm from the Antioch Church.
Yeah.
The environment around where you were raised and the values that you were taught as part of culture.
So the environment and the values, that's part of the culture. That's great. So it could be geographic location, even within the US, growing up in the Northeast versus Midwest and the West or the South might be different. And what about the second question of expressions of anxiety? Has anyone noticed just general definition of culture and how it could be the norms and values that really group people together, or one's heritage?
Yeah. Even from watching your videos, listening to them, I think with culture, you mentioned generation and the differences. And I grew up with grandparents, and you can definitely tell some of the older generation did not have the ability to express their emotions, at least. So to be able to express anxiety and to ask for help for that versus maybe a younger generation where it's more talked about.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I see a lot of nodding of heads.
I think that part of culture is like, what are you allowed to talk about, and how do you deal with problems, and so I think when it comes to anxiety, culture can influence like are you allowed to have anxiety, and like how do you deal with it, and or is it something you're allowed to talk about, and are you allowed to ask for help, and so yeah.
Maybe you're defining culture as a structure that kind of gives you the permission to, or I guess in some ways it has that power to allow you to speak about anxiety and maybe other expressions of mental health disorders or mental illnesses. But
I was thinking like my parents are both Jewish people from New York, very direct, and they're very open, and so like you say exactly what you think and you say all of it. And so I think, when you talk about something like anxiety, like the thought is like you convey whatever it is you're feeling in the fullest extent. And I know that like in some cultures it would be not that like in Jewish culture anxiety is awesome, but I think communicating about what is going on inside of your head is a very important part of Jewish culture.
So the communication style is influenced by culture. Exactly. Thank you. And I didn't get your name. What was your name?
I'm Shoshana.
Shauna?
Shoshana.
Soshana.
Like Susanna, but Hebrew.
Thank you, Soshana. Great. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. So we will kind of get an opportunity to share within our small groups again, but just the first culture that we're gonna, again, there are just so many definitions of culture, but for this workshop, we will just focus on, family, ethnicity, and faith. And first, for just to recap, I've talked about the culture of family, especially, I'm sure you talked a little bit or a significant portion of it in Dr. Pam Davis's session in the beginning, but how does, parents influence the culture of anxiety and expressions of anxiety within the family? And I've discussed a little bit about that in my recording as well. And what about, family value systems, and how does that either suppress or facilitate expressions of anxiety in each culture of the family? And it is more common in, again, not generalizing, because everyone's experiences are very different, even within the same ethnicity, but across the line, it seems like the non-Western cultures tend to appreciate the closeness of the family, the collectivistic side of the family, and sometimes the family's values and priorities get it's more prioritized than an individual's needs. So like as collectivistic culture, the family's culture and the wellness of the family as a whole is prioritized over individuals' needs. So how would in that situation affect one's expressions of anxiety when you don't have maybe as much of freedom to express, because you do need to think of your family as a whole and not necessarily prioritizing individuals' needs. And this often has been the case with when we're working with individuals who are from collectivistic family, that they often either deny or delay seeking mental health services because it brings shame to one's family, or that situationally they can't really focus on individuals' well-being because they're taking care of others in the family. So again, like when we talk about it in small groups, maybe these are some of the discussion points we can take. And we've also talked about how family values can be both protective factors, like in the closeness in family, the collectivistic characteristics of families can be protective factors against anxiety. Sometimes it could also be risk factor, as in it encourages individuals to avoid feeling anxiety or expressing their needs even when it's very prevalent. So another topic of discussion would be talking about what were some of your family's protective factors versus risk factors, whether it's your current family or your family of origin, the family that you grew up in. Maybe amongst your small groups, talk about how family's culture can be both protective and risk factors. And then thirdly, we want to talk about generations. I think one of you mentioned about, forgot the name. One of you, the names are not showing up for some reason, but so for generational differences, what was said about anxiety from your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, and versus your child's generation, so younger generation, how do they express anxiety, and how have they been either encouraged or discouraged within the family? So I'm gonna ask either Alex or someone to get us into those same groups and talk about, and these questions are in your worksheet. So even if you're in breakout groups, you can follow the worksheet. So this is a second question about, does your family actively assess the causes of stress and anxiety? And secondly, have you noticed any generational differences in expressions of stress and anxiety in your family? So if we can take about, let's see, next 15 minutes to talk about this within your group, that would be great. And the Antioch charge, if you guys want to split up into 3 groups of 3, so that each person can get the opportunity to share. Thanks.
Antioch Church group has been stick together as a small group.
So yeah, whatever you prefer, you can stick together as a group. So some of these questions might be more intimate than the other 2 sessions we've had before. So it's up to you to stay together or split up amongst your groups. But if they can get into their breakout groups now, that'd be great. Yeah, any questions from your group, or does anyone want to share with the large group?
We mulled over this balance with, our cultural differences between the trend of the current generation allowing more expression and discussing reasons that are causing the anxiety versus earlier generations. And then in terms of parenting a child, trying to bring both the skill of allowing an emotion and identifying the emotion, but also not giving full vent or giving, saying that you have control or an agency over what you do with those feelings.
Yeah. So structure is actually healthy for families. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Our group wants to know how to explain to those of another generation and/or of a different culture who may not understand anxiety or mental health as important as physical health. How do we go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we're gonna kind of touch on that a little later, but the importance of recognizing when we think of individuals as a holistic being, we're not just only physical being, but explaining to them that we're physical and mental, emotional, and spiritual. So there's a model that we follow as counselors. It's called biopsychosocial spiritual model. So basically we're biological and sociocultural and psychosocial and spiritual. So we're not just one. God didn't just create us to be physical, but also create us emotionally as well as spiritually. So just explaining that holistic health doesn't mean just your physical health, but your emotional health is part of your holistic being. Your mental health is part of your holistic health and being. That's like maybe a way to educate individuals, normalizing that everyone has those entities that combine together as a whole being. I think could be helpful. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think with mental health, there's a lot of stigma around seeking mental health care and help. And again, another way to reduce that kind of stigma is to say when individuals are sick, they go see doctors. So when they're physically ill, they go see doctors. They wouldn't try to treat cancer. Maybe some of them do, but treat cancer in a non-medical route. And similarly, when comes down to mental illness, you would seek an expert who are trained to treat these illnesses and not, again, it wouldn't just go away on its own, especially when it's more of a form of illness rather than, again, we will talk more into that a little bit later, but I know there is existing stigma within the church community about mental illness. We'll talk about that. Anyone else wanted to share? So I think Jeff mentioned about generational differences. What did your group say about the younger generation experiencing more anxiety? What were the causes that your group thought were contributing? Jeff, did you get that question or?
Yeah, I don't know if we went into the causes of, I guess at least I made the assumption that the causes of our anxiety are pretty consistent as we live our life, and all generations experience anxiety, but each generation interacted with it differently or allowed its expression differently. So
Yeah, thank you.
Our group didn't exactly have questions, but one of the big conversations we had was kind of learning from the culture that you grew up in, healthy or not healthy, and then taking the good for the next generation, the one that you're choosing, spouse and then kids and things like that. So you're kind of chosen family. And taking the good from it and keeping that going, but also kind of learning from the things that maybe weren't the best. And Kelsey shared about a book, Defining Decade, and how the whole idea of it is like, you can't choose the family you're born into, but you can choose the family that you create. And I think when you add the word culture to that, even with anxiety or mental health, that's really huge, because if you grew up in a house where it wasn't healthy, you literally feel and see what that is, but you have the power to be able to kind of change that for the next.
That's great. Well, part of it is our choice that we make in the future. Yeah. Great. These are great discussions. We are going to move on to culture of ethnicity, and I am aware that maybe not many of us are aware of or have witnessed these somatization of psychological distress manifested physiologically. But so I wanted to kind of introduce this because there will be individuals, and whether it's in your family or different generations or within your church, among different ethnic groups, where mental health and anxiety is expressed more through physiological complaints. And the examples were very common ones are kind of like headaches, indigestion, just having pain, generalized pain. And I was wondering if maybe your group or individually, your group might have a question on what this might look like. But maybe within your groups, kind of talk about what are some ethnically and normalized expressions of anxiety. And in my presentation, I talked about how there is ethnic differences with symptom manifestation, and some cultures externalize their symptoms while others internalize. And so somatization is more of like the internalization of stress that one's feeling. And it's just societally also more acceptable in some cultures to internalize and externalize. So I gave an example of in Thai culture, parents were more readily seeking medical help if the child complained of, made physiological complaints versus if they made more of emotional or mental health related complaints. Because again, the society says some forms of symptom manifestation and how they conceptualize issues is more accepted than not. So I wonder if your group maybe can talk about some of these differences that could exist. Or I heard that Antioch Church, you are serving youth, and I don't know how ethnically diverse your youth group is, but have you seen, or like looking back, have you noticed any of youth students kind of complaining, or they've complained about physical illnesses, but could you kind of identify the tie between their stress and how they're describing their pain, and could they really be explaining a form of anxiety? So it will be a topic of discussion. And I think I'm really sorry about not getting all the names, but one mentioned about, how do you explain to individuals who are only focusing on the physical health of individuals, but again, we're not just mindless bodies or disembodied minds. I think this quote by one of my former professors is still is stuck with me as I see clients, because I just see how interconnected these two are, our mind and body, that we are both mind and the body, and also the spirit, and not just the body. So I want to kind of see how we can help individuals recognize that we are all interconnected as a whole being. And these are just some examples of what anxiety looks like. And mainly in non-Western cultures, many of these anxiety looked very different. It's a lot about like physiological symptoms than and internalized symptoms than externalized. And many of like, so for example, the Taijin Kyofu in Japan, it entails the blushing of your face, racing of the heart, palpitation, and just you can kind of, you'll be able to readily recognize someone, like it looks like they're about to have a heart attack, but it's more of, again, the symptom that's manifested and shown, which is pretty different from what you would see in a Western culture. So again, any questions about culture of ethnicity before we get into our groups? And I've only listed a couple here, and there are more diverse forms of anxiety disorders in different cultures. So we're gonna kind of get into, again, our groups, and this time only for 10 minutes, and kind of share with each other what you've seen within your own culture, and cultures of others, other ethnic groups. And if you've also experienced this, quote unquote somatization, maybe give an example or two of what that would look like. Welcome back, everyone. Yeah, I asked if anyone could share what your group shared. I think that will be helpful for others to hear.
I could start by sharing. So I come from a Korean immigrant background, and I noticed that my mom would complain of not being able to fall asleep or having very bad dreams at night. I also had a lot of headaches when I was younger, but now I'm starting to realize perhaps those were examples of somatization in my family. And I experienced something very different when I was in college, where it was interesting how everyone was so open about, more, conversation about mental, also anxiety. But what was interesting was that perhaps we didn't really know healthy ways of dealing with their anxiety, because especially during finals time, other people's anxiety would kind of give me anxiety, and we'd have to just like separate each other. So yeah, there were interesting things, different things that I saw inside of my house, outside of my house.
Thank you, Susanna. Yeah, those are good examples of self-motivation. Maybe during finals, anyone experience like binge eating? I definitely have had that now. We will move on to the last one because we want to have enough time for questions later. But the last one is our culture of Christian faith. And we've kind of touched on this throughout our presentation today. But the questions that we should kind of think about is, what has been our churches or even small groups message regarding stress and anxiety? And what does the scripture talk about? How does the scripture talk about anxiety, and how do people, I think more important thing is how do people interpret the scripture to overcome their anxiety? And Philippians 4:6 is probably the most frequently quoted Bible verse about how not to be anxious, or it tells you directly, do not be anxious about anything. So we'll talk about I wanted to clarify when I say the anxiety as a sin and anxiety as a disorder is more of a, when we think about, the noetic effects of sin, which is that, sin pervades all areas of our lives, including mental illness. But here the distinction is between a more like a voluntary act of sin, where you're kind of contributing through your behavior or decision, versus an illness such as illness of anxiety that can be largely involuntary. And in my presentation, I talked about how anxiety is not only shown through choice, but many times derived from genetic components, physical changes in the brain, individuals' personality traits that they've been born with, and life events that could have affected. So when we think about sin and our voluntary versus involuntary contributions, maybe discuss what could be those specific factors, and how our Christian faith should really support individuals who are experiencing anxiety as pastors, church leaders, and what are the roles of pastors and churches versus counselors and versus doctors, and how we can best support our church members who are experiencing specifically the involuntary form of anxiety. So maybe we can get into our small groups again and talk about this for the next 10 minutes. Okay, we're all back. All right, any thoughts about the last portion of this session? I also, someone gonna speak. I also was gonna say or ask, do you think the church has a role in addressing mental health needs and illnesses of its members? I see some nodding. Would you like to share?
I don't have anything to add. I would just say yes, the church has a role.
The church has a role. Thank you, Courtney.
I can kind of add, I shared with my group kind of an answer to all these questions in one, but I think like what you're saying, the church definitely has a role. And we kind of brought up the idea of, we wonder, because for me, even though maybe it hasn't been the church's social media post, so to say, they haven't said it from the platform, a lot of things I feel like I've seen is there's like classes out there to better your marriage, to better your parenting, cancer support groups. And I don't see a whole lot of mental health stuff coming from the church. So that relates to me that the message is it's not as important as other things. But it definitely has a role. And we were saying how that could be because someone mentioned our group that mental health isn't like you broke your leg and you'll be better 6 weeks from now. So I can commit myself to you for these next 6 weeks. It's a much long-term kind of thing. And then it was just this idea that could be overwhelming for a pastor or for a leader or a mentor or whatever that is that you may have a role in. But then taking in the idea of, but you can help them set up that support system, that you don't have to be the end all be all for them. That's ultimately God, because he can literally sit with us every single second of the day. But the church is the one that's going to be able to point you to him in that way, but also be able to still point you to if you just need community, if you need counseling, and all these different things that are going to be able to help you and be there with you for the next rest of your life or years or whatever.
Yeah. Your relationship with them could continue. Even if they're in counseling, they could continue. Right? And your role as a church leader, youth group teacher might look different from a counselor, but you still have a significant role in that individual's life as a support system. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and I shared this in my recording earlier, but just the importance of church has a role. And I've also seen this in my own personal research that that individuals have responded that the church does have a role in addressing not just the needs of spiritual, but also mental, physical, and sometimes financial. Because the church, again, the holistic health has a role in meeting and nurturing individuals' well-being. So I believe they do have a very important and significant role that many other non-church goers may not have access to. And a lot of, I would say, even research about like immigrants and refugees, church has been that safe haven for many of these groups, which have served them to meet the needs even far beyond that spiritual needs. So I think it can't really be separable, but oftentimes we do tend to separate the church members' needs, but they all come together. And yeah, anyone else in the group share?
I think, not sharing from what we talked about, but I think that one thing that Gordon-Conwell could do to help the local church is, I know in the past I have had like a list of Christian counselors in the area. I know there's probably a liability that goes with putting out such a list, but when it comes to the point of saying, I think it would be good for you to see a counselor. Gee, do you know someone I could see? And then, somebody who's in a tender situation, to say that now you have this big project of trying to find a counselor who is, competent and kind. And so, if there is a list, here in Massachusetts, I would love such a thing.
Yeah, and I can forward you a list like that, but I think it's true that the church also could have certain resources for the church members to and readily available in case someone do need that information sooner than later. So some of the, again, recommendations, this is some sort of recap, but just normalizing the mental health and mental health needs and expressions of anxiety within the church will be important. And I don't know how many of you are pastors or church leaders, but even speaking about mental health on the pulpit will be just a good example for the church members to reduce their stigma and even barriers of seeking help. So that's just empowering in itself of your leaders speaking about the importance of mental health in the church, and the emphasis on it. And this is just practical tool for you to take. It would be one way to distinguish when does a church member need counseling versus not is to do like a simple screening if the member is willing. And this is specific screening tool for depression and anxiety. And there are just other tools available out there that I can recommend if you're looking for something other than depression and anxiety. But it's just way for, sometimes you can't really tell, does this person need counseling or does this person just need like, mentorship or pastoral counseling. So this would be another way to approach your church members' needs. I just want to, maybe we only have 1 minute, but you will get the slide after this workshop. So you have all the references here if you need extra or additional resources.